10 springs of letters and no reply. Then a worn envelope arrived in her hand. The pen dried up before I'd written the third word, third time that week. I scraped the nib on the edge of the bottle, got enough to finish the line, and then I sat there in the lamplight looking at what I'd put down. Elsa, I wonder sometimes if these reach you at all. I folded it like all the others, creased it at the center, then again, tucked it into the envelope I'd already addressed, same hand, same careful letters across the front, the same Missouri township I'd written so many times the pen knew the shape before I did. I pressed the flap with my thumb, set it on the corner of the table where the others always waited to go into town. Then I went to bed and lay there in the dark, listening to the wind come off the flats and hit the north wall of the cabin. It had been 9 years. I'll back up some, because there's no way to say what happened that October without you knowing what the years before it were. My name is Cal Dunmore, 51 years old when she showed up. A rancher, if you want to call it that. I ran a small spread in the Powder River country, southeast Wyoming, not far from a settlement called Harlan's Crossing. 160 acres I'd proved up on in 71, a house I'd built with 2 neighbors who were both dead by now, and a herd that fluctuated between doing poorly and doing worse depending on the winter. I was not a man who complained about his lot. I'd learned that much. But I will tell you, the place had a stillness to it in those years that was not the good kind of stillness. My wife Nadine died in the spring of 1873. Fever took her in 6 days. We'd had 2 years together, which was not enough, and no children, which meant when she went there was nothing left of her in the house but her comb on the windowsill and a quilt she'd made the winter before. I kept the quilt on the chair. Didn't sleep under it. Just kept it there, folded over the arm of the chair, because putting it somewhere else felt like a decision I wasn't ready to make. Elsa Vanthorpe came into my life about 8 months after that. I say came into my life. She came through Harlan's Crossing on a wagon with her brother and his family, Missouri people heading north toward the Montana territories to take up land. They stopped 2 nights because the brother had a lame wheel and needed the smith. I was in town for feed, and the reverend at the little church there was a man named Aldous who knew me, and he introduced us the way people did then. Her brother was a serious man with a serious face. Elsa was different. She was 34, dark-haired, and she had a way of looking at you that was not bold exactly but was complete, like she saw all the way to the back wall. We talked both evenings. Once at the reverend's supper table, once on the church steps in the cold, her brother standing 20 feet away watching the street. We talked about things that didn't matter and some things that did. I told her about the ranch. She told me about Missouri, about the family farm she'd grown up on, about her first husband who died of a riverboat accident before they'd had a year together. I recognized something in that, how a person looks when they've learned to hold loss quietly. When the wagon left the 3rd morning, I stood in the street and watched it go. And that was that, I thought. Except 6 weeks later I wrote her a letter, addressed it to the township in the Montana territories her brother had mentioned, a settlement called Granger's Ford. I didn't know if it would reach her. I said I'd thought about our conversation. I said I'd be glad to hear from her if she was so inclined. I sent it and waited. After 2 months I figured it hadn't reached her, or she hadn't wanted to reply, and I put it out of my mind mostly. Then I wrote again in the spring. This is the part that I did not talk about for a long time, not because I was ashamed of it, but because when you say it out loud it sounds like a particular kind of foolishness. I wrote her letters for 9 years. Not every week. Sometimes I'd go 3 months without writing, but I averaged, I reckon, about 5 or 6 a year, sometimes more if the winter was hard and the nights were long. Sometimes it was just a few lines, the first calf of the season, a peculiar storm, a man I'd met at the trading post who reminded me of something she'd said. Sometimes it was 3 pages, written over several evenings because I'd been out in the pasture all day with nothing but the horses, and by the time I got back I had too many thoughts stacked up. None of them came back, not one. I told myself various things over the years. That the mail was bad up that way, which was true. That she'd moved on and the letters weren't reaching her, which was possible. That she'd married again and it wouldn't be right for her to correspond with a man she'd met twice, which seemed probable. Somewhere around year 4 or 5 I stopped expecting an answer and just wrote because I don't know exactly how to say this. Because it was the only place I talked like a human being. Out loud I was a man of about 40 words a day, most of them to a horse or a dog. But sitting down with a pen in the lamplight, writing to a woman I barely knew, I could think straight. I could hear myself. Does that make sense? It probably doesn't, but that's what it was. I did not think of it as love exactly, or I told myself I didn't. I thought of it as a direction. The way a compass points north, not because north is doing anything particular, but because that's just what the needle does. My neighbor Russ Falconer asked me once around year 7 whether I'd ever heard from a woman I used to write to. He'd seen me headed to the post office one time more than he should have. I told him I had not. He said that was a shame. I said it was fine. He let it go. Good man, Russ, knew when not to push. The years themselves were not terrible, I want to say that. I had the land and the land was real. I knew the feel of every acre of it, which draws water in a wet spring, which goes hard in August, where the cattle drifted when the north wind came. I knew my horses. I had neighbors I respected and who respected me. I was not a miserable man, but there was a certain width missing from things. Like everything I did and saw was one note, and somewhere in the back of my mind there was supposed to be another note alongside it, and there wasn't. I got good at not thinking about that. Year 9. The winter of 1882 into 83 was rough in the Powder River country. Not the worst I'd seen, but mean enough. We lost 8 head between December and March, and that was 8 I couldn't afford. By the time the ground softened in April, I was looking at the account book, and the account book was not looking back at me with any encouragement. I was 50 years old. I'd been out here alone for going on a decade. And something had gone quiet in me that spring. Not sad exactly, more like the way a fire gets when it's been burning low so long it forgets it was ever high. I wrote her a letter in March, last one I wrote. I didn't know it was the last one at the time. I just wrote it the same as always. Told her it had been 9 years in case she didn't know, in case somehow the letters had been reaching her after all and she'd just been counting different. Told her about the winter. Told her the Harlan's Crossing Church had finally got a real bell, which seemed like something she might find worth knowing. I said I didn't reckon I'd be writing much more. Not as a threat or a plea. I just said it. I think I was tired. Sealed it, sent it to Granger's Ford, Montana, same as always. Then I went about the spring work. She arrived in September. I did not know that immediately. What I knew, on the Tuesday afternoon she arrived, was that there was a wagon coming down the track from the main road, and it was not Russ Falconer's, and it was not the supply man, and whoever it was had missed the turn to Harlan's Crossing by about 2 miles, so either they were lost or they were coming to me specifically. I was splitting wood when I saw it. I set the axe down on the chopping block and straightened up and watched it come. It was a plain wagon, 1 horse, a gray mare about 12 years old from the look of her, and a woman driving it alone. She drove the way a person drives when they've been driving a long time, not tense, not casual, just present, the reins easy in her hands. She pulled up 20 feet from me and looked at me for a moment without saying anything. I looked back at her. 12 years is a long time. The hair was different, more gray in it, and she was heavier through the face in the way people get when they've lived hard winters and worked hard days. But the way she looked at you, all the way to the back wall, that was the same. I said, Elsa. She said, Cal Dunmore, you look exactly the same as I remembered. I said I doubted that very much. She said maybe some older. She half smiled when she said it. I went over and helped her down from the wagon, because it was a high step and I was standing right there, and when she took my hand her grip was firm, the kind a person has when they've been doing for themselves for years. She came down and stood in front of me. We were close enough that I could see the travel in her, the road dust on her coat, the tiredness around her eyes, 2 days at least on the trail. I said, "You came from Montana." She said, "I came from Missouri. Been living back in Missouri these 6 years since my brother sold the Montana land." She paused. Then she said, "I owe you an explanation." I said she didn't have to do that right this second. I said she could come inside. I said she looked like she needed some coffee and maybe something to eat. She said, "That's kind." And then she reached into the pocket of her coat, the left side, deep in, and she brought out an envelope. It was the color of old cream, that envelope, worn at the corners, and she held it out to me. I took it, turned it over. My own handwriting across the front, the Granger's Ford address. I said, "This is one of mine." She said, "They all came to me eventually, not at the time." She looked at the envelope in my hand, then up at me. "I didn't get them until my brother sold the Montana land. He had 6 years of post held at the trading station up there. When he settled up, they gave him a bundle. He sent it down to me in Missouri." I stood there holding that envelope. She said, "There were 31 of them, Cal." I said I knew the number. She said, "I read them all in 3 days, and then I spent about 4 months figuring out what to do about it, and then I did this." She gestured at the wagon, at the gray mare, at the 200 miles of Wyoming she'd apparently come across to get here. We went inside. I made coffee. She sat at the table and looked at the room, took stock of it the way a person does when they're seeing something they've heard described and are measuring it against what they'd imagined. She didn't say anything about the quilt on the chair. I was aware of it suddenly, but she didn't say anything. I brought the cups over and sat across from her, and she wrapped both hands around hers and said, "I want you to understand something." I did not write back because I didn't want to. The first 2 years the letters weren't reaching me. We moved 3 times in that country and the post was a disaster. And then when I understood they might be coming but missing me, I didn't know how to write back to an address I had that might be 2 years old. And then I thought, he's stopped by now, surely. And then another letter would come, not to me but into that pile at the trading station, and I didn't know about any of it. I said I understood that. She looked at me. She said, "Do you?" I said the mail up in that country was bad. I always knew that. I always figured that was some of it. She said it was all of it, Cal. I held my cup in both hands the same as her. Outside, the gray mare was standing easy in the yard. The light was going amber the way it does in September in Wyoming, long and level, coming in through the one west-facing window. I said, "Why'd you come back to Missouri?" She said her second husband, she'd married in Montana in '76, a man named Voss, had died of a lung sickness in '77. That he'd been a decent man and she'd been fond of him, and she'd meant to stay on up there. But his family was difficult and the land wasn't proving up. So she'd come home to Missouri, to a cousin's farm, and she'd been there 6 years, and it was a fine life, a quiet life, but... She didn't finish that sentence. She didn't have to. I said, "But..." She said, "But I read 31 letters from a man in Wyoming, and I took a hard look at myself." I said, "What did that look tell you?" She was quiet a moment. Then she said that I was tired of living like a woman waiting to stop waiting. She said it plain and flat, the way you say something when you've been carrying it long enough that it doesn't hurt to say anymore. She said, "You wrote me 31 times, Cal. You told me about your ranch and your cattle and your winters and a bell on a church and a horse you were partial to. You told me things a man doesn't tell anyone, and not once did you sound sorry for yourself. You just wrote." I didn't say anything. She said that meant something to me, even when I didn't know about it yet. She stayed that first night because it was too late to make Harlan's Crossing before dark. I gave her the cabin and slept in the barn, which in September is no hardship. I lay there in the straw with the mare moving in the next stall, and I looked up at the dark rafters and I thought about 31 letters. I knew what was in them. I knew what I'd said, and what I hadn't said, and what I'd said sideways without meaning to. It's strange, knowing a woman has read all of that. It's like she'd been standing in the back of the room for years and you hadn't known. Not an altogether bad feeling. The next morning she made breakfast, which I did not ask her to do, and she moved around that kitchen like she'd been in it before, like she'd already made some decisions about where things should be. I watched her from the table and didn't say anything about it. She set down a plate and sat across from me and said, "I have a proposition for you." I said, "All right." She said, "I'll stay the fall. Help with whatever needs doing before winter. I can cook and I can work and I'm not interested in being a burden. And if by November this is not," she paused, "if by November it seems like a foolish idea, I'll go back to Missouri and we'll part as friends and that'll be that." I said, "And if it doesn't seem like a foolish idea?" She looked at me across the plate. She said, "Then we'll figure out the next part." I said, "That's a reasonable proposition." She said, "I thought so." I'll tell you what those months were. They were work first. Elsa was not wrong about herself, she could work. She had a Midwesterner's sense of time, which is to say she was up before light and didn't sit down until there was nothing left to do. She helped with the cattle when I needed a second pair of hands, which a one-man operation always does. She repaired the north wall chinking that I'd been putting off for 2 years. She planted a kitchen garden in the near bare patch behind the cabin that wouldn't yield much this late in the season but would be ready in spring. She rode well enough. She knew her way around horses. And she talked some. Not more than was natural. But she talked the way I needed someone to talk, without needing me to fill every silence, without being alarmed by quiet, without requiring me to be more than I was. She'd say something and I'd say something back, and sometimes that would be all, and neither of us would feel the need to make it more. I'll tell you, there were evenings at that table, me with a mug and her with her mending or a letter she was writing back to her cousin, and the lamp burning and the wind off the flats, and I felt something come back. Not big, not sudden. Like circulation returning to a cold hand. That slow and that much of a relief. In October she came out to the east pasture with me to check on a heifer that had been off her feed, and we stood at the fence together in the thin, cold sunlight and watched the animal for a while, and Elsa said, "She just needs company. That heifer, look at her. She's been by herself out here." I said, "Well, that's a heifer for you." Elsa said, "That's a lot of things." She said it without looking at me. She was still watching the heifer. And I felt that land, the way certain words land when they've been true for a long time, and you've just been waiting for someone to say them. I didn't say anything, but I moved closer to her at the fence, enough that our shoulders were near to touching, and she didn't move away. I need to tell you about the day she found the letters. Mid-October, I was up on the ridge looking at the fence line. She was at the cabin, I thought, or maybe in the garden. I came back in the late afternoon and she was sitting at the table. She had a letter in her hand, one of mine, one of the old ones from the first years. I stopped in the doorway. She said I wasn't snooping. I was looking for the nails, the ones you said were in the tin on the second shelf, and I found, she gestured at the table. There was a tied bundle there. Maybe 10 letters, maybe 12. The returns, the ones that had come back with no deliverable address when the Granger's Ford settlement had folded, years earlier. A few. Some years I'd had a few come back. She had one open in her hand. She said, "Is this all right?" I said, "They're yours." She looked down at the paper. She said, "Cal." She said it quietly. She said, "You wrote in this one." She read a line to herself rather than out loud. Then she set it down. She looked up at me and her eyes were wet, and she didn't do anything about that. I came the rest of the way into the room. I sat down across from her, the bundle of old letters between us on the table. She said, "You never wrote like a man expecting anything." I said I wasn't expecting anything. Not after the first few years, anyway. She said, then why? I thought about it. I said, because you listened. Even when you weren't there, even when there was nobody. She put her hand on the table, not reaching for me exactly, just putting it there flat like an offering or like she was steadying herself, and I put my hand over hers. Her hand was cold from the outside work and the day's chill, and I held it in both of mine until it wasn't. She said, I'm sorry it took so long. I said, you came, that's what counts. She said, I should have come sooner. I said, Elsa, you came, the rest of it is just geography. She laughed at that, a small sound, through the wetness in her eyes. Then she turned her hand over under mine and held on. There's things I want to say about November, and things I'll keep. We had a hard week of cold in the first part of the month. Early for it, but not unheard of. The cattle needed moving down from the upper pasture, and it was 2 days' work. Elsa rode with me both days. Second day the cold had real teeth in it, and by the time we got back to the cabin we were both moving slow. She got the stove going and I saw to the horses, and when I came inside she put a pot on and poured 2 glasses of something her cousin had sent. Some kind of elderberry wine that looked like medicine and tasted like medicine, had a better cousin. We sat by the stove. She said, my deadline is in 3 weeks. I said, I know. She said, you haven't said anything about it. I said I'd been thinking about what to say. She looked at me in the stove light, waiting, her hands around the glass. The firelight was on her face, and I thought about a woman willing to read 31 letters and then drive a gray mare 200 miles across Wyoming. And I thought about 9 years of lamplight and dried ink and the sound of the wind on the north wall, and all of it was right there in that room. I said, I don't want you to go back to Missouri. She didn't answer right away, let it sit. Then she said, what do you want exactly? I said, I want you to stay. She was quiet a moment more. Then she said, that's what I came to hear. I came to hear you say it to my face. I said, you could have written a letter. She said I could have, and waited to see what you'd do. I said, I'd have come to Missouri. She said, I know you would have. That's why I beat you to it. She said it with that half-smile, and I felt it somewhere behind the breastbone, that warmth. Not the young kind, not the reckless kind, but the kind that a man who has been cold for a long time knows for what it is. We married in the Harlan's Crossing Church in December. Reverend Aldous had gone north years before, but the new man was steady and got through the words without excess. Russ Falconer stood up with me. Elsa's cousin had come down from Missouri by then, a woman named Bet who cried at appropriate moments and seemed satisfied with the whole arrangement. It was cold that day. The wind was up. Elsa wore a green dress, dark green, the color of creek water in shadow, and she walked to the front of that little church like she'd made up her mind and wasn't revisiting it. When it was done and we were walking out, she took my arm, both hands the way she did. She looked up at me once, just once, without saying anything, just looked. And what was in that look, well, you know the word for it, I won't dress it up. We've had 12 years since then, 12 winters in the Powder River country. The spread is better than it was. We proved up on the next parcel east, and the herd is twice what it was in those thin years. Elsa has a kitchen garden now that would make a market farmer envious. The cabin has 2 more rooms I built the second spring after we married, because it turned out we needed them. I think sometimes about the years before, the letters going to Granger's Ford, the oil lamp and the dried-up pen and the wind on the north wall. I don't think about them with regret. I think about them the way you think about a road that was long and difficult and that brought you exactly where you needed to be. The bundle of returned letters is in the tin on the second shelf where she found them. I don't know why I keep them there. Maybe because that's where the nails are and I go to that shelf often, and when I move the tin I know what's in it. A man who wrote into silence for 9 years and was answered. Not the way he expected. not on the timetable he'd imagined, but answered fully in the best way possible. She still gets letters from Missouri. Her cousin Bet writes faithfully. Sometimes Elsa reads me pieces of them at the table after supper. Sometimes she doesn't. I don't always follow the particulars of what's happening in Missouri. But there are evenings when she looks up from whatever she's doing and looks at me across the room. And it's that same look from the first time, the day she pulled up in the yard with the gray mare and the road dust on her coat, all the way to the back wall, complete. When a woman looks at a man like that, it's not nothing. It's the whole deal is what it is. Everything a man lives a life quietly hoping for, right there across the kitchen table. I have learned not to say too much about it, just to take it in. That's the best I can tell you about how to do with that kind of luck when it finally comes to you. You just take it in.